All right. So, one of the things that we're going to talk about again today is we're going through our statement of beliefs and giving a breakdown of what some of these things mean. Number 9 was about the creation of a distinct or separate organization, separate from the Jewish people, for believers in Messiah, and we rejected that. Number 10 was discussing about the Moed'im, the appointed times uh, that Scripture sets up about things like Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, what we call Pentecost, Shavuot, and then those in the fall. And so I'm starting off with number 11 today, point number 11 on our statement of beliefs, and it's talking about the Shabbat. The Shabbat is not just one of those Moedim, but it's really the first one that is created. So the Sabbath, one of those feast days, one of those times of appointed times, reflect God's pattern found in the first 7 days of creation and is a governing principle of Messiah's future kingdom. Our life in the Messianic era is based on the idea of rest as reflected in the Sabbath and described in Hebrews. Keeping the Sabbath then actually reinforces belief in the Creator and our future hope. So, one of those things, the consequences of getting away from the Sabbath is that you're also getting away from the foundational first 7 days of creation. So that's why I say that is that as Sabbath decreases, so does faith in belief in the foundational starting point of the Scriptures. Because why, if we're not keeping the Sabbath, then the reason for that pattern being set up is even more in question. And then it's also our future hope, because that's the Sabbath rest that is to come that Hebrews talks about. It's just the governing principles of things that the Messiah is going to enforce for us. And even when you get to something like Isaiah 66, when it talks about the new heavens and the new earth, which I will make, will endure before me, so your descendants and your name will endure, as a declaration of Adonai. He says, and it will come to pass. So even on that new heavens and new earth, says it will come to pass that from one new moon to another, which is a monthly Sabbath or monthly recognition, and from one Shabbat to another, all flesh will come to bow down before me, says Adonai. So all flesh means every single person will be keeping the Shabbat in that Messianic era, in that time when the new heavens and the new earth are in effect. And so again, it's a principle that has become more and more important, that if we know that's our future, and if we know that's where we're going, and if we know that's the system that the Father is going to be enacting and enforcing, then there's no reason why those principles and that pattern shouldn't be governing and directing our lives now, because we are His ambassadors, and in fact we are supposed to be representing another kingdom. So Shabbat is a part of that other kingdom. So keeping the Sabbath then reinforces belief in the Creator and our future hope. An example of the principle that clear scriptures interprets unclear passages or practices, and this is an important idea. Scripture best interprets Scripture. I hope we should all agree with that. And when we have unclear scriptures, then a clear scripture should set the pattern or set the definitions or set the meanings of things. So clear scripture interprets unclear passages or practices. Consider which idea provides the best definition of the Lord's Day. And growing up in traditional Baptist circles and everything, and reading Revelation, being that John was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day, and all these things, that was always defined a certain way, meaning Sunday. So, what is the best definition of the Lord's Day? Is the best definition based on the phrase, the first day of the week, which results in a change, over 1,000 years of changing thousands of years of practice into a new day of worship, which is Sunday. Is that really the best definition? Are you going to start interpreting the Lord's Day to mean Sunday and thus justify this change? Is that the best thing to do? And let me encourage you, if you're on our website, there should be a section on there on the blog where I have a few writings. I need to publish a lot more, but one of the first long articles that I really ever wrote was, why did I go to the Sabbath? And what was the biblical principles and arguments and reasoning for all that. And it's long and extensive if you really want to look that up, about what does even that phrase first day of the week really mean. It doesn't, first day of the week is an interpretation, or it's you're inserting some ideas into it, when if you know the biblical calendar, then there is a meaning that fits perfectly within the Jewish world and structure. I would encourage you to go and look in that. So, is the best definition based on the phrase first day of the week? Or does the description of Yeshua as the Lord of the Sabbath provide a better definition that requires no change in practice? So, Yeshua describes himself as the Lord of the Sabbath. So the clear passage, I am the Lord of the Sabbath, that means the Lord's day is the Sabbath. It's his day. It's a day set aside for him. It's a day set aside to approach Adonai. It's a day that goes and recognizes all the way back to Genesis, and that the Israelite people were able to, if they weren't able to keep it before because they were slaves and didn't have a say, they were able to reestablish that for the people during the Exodus experience and their time in the wilderness. Because even if I've heard some people argue, it's like, well, they lost track of the Sabbath, and while they were in Egypt, they have no way of knowing which day it is. Well, even if that's true, God reestablished the Sabbath for them by having the manna show up 6 days during the week. On the 6th day, they collect the double portion, because on the 7th day, the Shabbat, no manna is going to appear. And so they had the Sabbath, the 7th day, reinforced for 40 years of their wandering in the desert, and they've never lost it. And the great thing about letting Scripture define Scripture, that the Lord's Day defined with that passage of the Lord of the Sabbath, there's no change in meaning, no change in practice that God had set up all the way back in the Ten Commandments. The Sabbath is number 4. The Sabbath is in the Ten Commandments for a reason. And most of us grew up basically believing in 9 out of 10 and practicing 9 out of 10, and then acting like the Sunday is the new Sabbath or something else like that. And so the statement number 11 goes on and it says, this is necessary to establish because Scripture is the standard for faith and practice. We say that, and it's important for us to actually do that, believe that, and practice that. Scripture is the standard for faith and practice. So if that's true, if we accept that idea, then no person or ecclesiastical body has the authority to change clear scriptural teaching and practice. Okay? They don't just say so just because they get together in a group and say, we're going to do this differently. That doesn't mean they really have the authority to do that, because the only one who can change the king's law is the king. All right? So no person or ecclesiastical body has the authority to change clear scriptural teaching and practice without, now you could do it if without a similarly clear and explicit command. So if the king comes along and says, yes, I told you to do it that way. Now I am explicitly stating I want you to do it this way. And that's the problem. That's the problem with how we have made this change, because rightly understood, and again, that article I mentioned goes extensively into this, no New Testament passage explicitly directs the believing community to abandon the Sabbath for another day. At best, it says that they, some of the, they would meet on the first day of the week and discuss things in the book of Acts and different other things like that. But even then, it doesn't say they weren't keeping the Sabbath. It just says that they were meeting on the first day of the week, basically, and in the Jewish world, that means after sundown, after the sundown on the Sabbath. Remember, their day begins when the sun goes down. So they would keep the Shabbat, and then as soon as sundown comes, they kept meeting, or they met again in the morning. But it never says that they weren't keeping the Shabbat. It never says that they replaced Shabbat. It just says that they met either again or in addition to Shabbat. And that's important for us to keep in mind. It's just an observation that they were meeting, but it is not a command saying, and this is the pattern from all time, and we will all continue to do this and go away from the Shabbat practice. It's just an observation of practice, but it's not a command. And that even really gets into the heart of that article, is that first day of the week is also an interpretation, because in the Greek, the way it talks about it is the literal translation of that means one of the Sabbaths. Sabbaths plural. One of, miaton sabbathon. I'm probably saying that wrong because my pronunciation is terrible. But it means one of the Sabbaths. The first day, if they were talking about first, they'd use a different Greek word for that. Day is not in there at all. So it literally means one of the Sabbaths. And every time you see that construction, when it talks about them meeting, it's actually during this time right now. It's always in that time period between the Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits, and what we call Pentecost or Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks. So one of the Sabbaths is actually referring to the counting of the Omer. One of the Sabbaths that they count during the 49 days leading up to Pentecost is what that phrase is always referring to. It's always between this time and Pentecost. So rightly understood, and if you rightly understand the biblical calendar, one of the Sabbaths makes perfect sense to a Jewish person who's reading this, because it's like, oh, they were meeting on one of the Omer count Shabbats. So it's not that hard of a thing, and you're not having to change thousands of years of God's command, and you're not having to change thousands of years of practice. And here's the consequence. So rightly understood, no New Testament passage explicitly directs the believing community to abandon the Sabbath and start meeting on another day. The only thing accomplished by changing the day of worship and fellowship away from the Sabbath is to separate Jew and Gentile from each other and make it seem like we are distinct faiths. And that goes back to number 9, where the statement number 9, where it talks about how faith in Messiah Yeshua was never supposed to create a separate religion or organization distinct from or apart from or separate from the Jewish people in the kingdom of Israel. That's what changing the day of worship accomplishes. So the only thing accomplished by changing the day of worship and fellowship away from the Shabbat is to separate Jew and Gentile from each other and make it seem like we are distinct faiths. And that, it says, when God's goal has always been to make us, Jew and Gentile, one new man, make us one nation together, bring us together as citizens of the Commonwealth of Israel and members of the covenants of promise, right? So anything, and this is the bottom line of it, anything that intentionally separates us and pulls Jew and Gentile apart and puts up the wall of separation, and basically the one that Yeshua, the Messiah, tore down, anything that intentionally puts that wall back up is sin. That's the bottom line. And when it comes down to it, when you look at church history, when you read the writings of really why they made the change from Shabbat to Sunday, you look at that separation from the Jews and anti-Semitism are the primary motivation for making this change. And that's a really sad reality. Scriptural arguments to support changing from the Sabbath are after the fact. Right. Scriptural arguments to support changing from the Sabbath are reasoned and determined after the fact to justify the desire for change and to justify that separation. And that's a sad reality of church history. They had decided that we don't want to be like those Jews. We don't want to be with those Jews. We are going to honor and push those practices. We don't want to be dependent upon them telling us what to do. Now that we are in Messiah, we're going to lord it over them. We're going to, and all those things, we are going to make the decisions for ourselves and separate from Jerusalem. We're going to separate from the land. We're going to separate from the priesthood. We're going to separate from their holidays. We're going to separate from Shabbat because we don't want to associate with them. And so here's a way we're going to do it. We're going to change to Sunday worship. And sadly enough, again, that's when you read their writings, that's a lot of what is built into it. And then the historical question comes up from that is, if we know that anti-Semitism and this sin of separation is the basis for a decision, even if it was made centuries ago, are we bound to a decision like that today? Should we be? Is it smart to continue in a decision that was made for the wrong reasons? Why should we continue practicing a decision that was made for the wrong reasons? If you know that anti-Semitism was the basis of the decision, why would you want to continue to practice it? So, imagine if there's laws and things that you just do day to day, and you find out, oh, they did that because of racist reasons. They didn't like certain groups or skin colors or whatever reason. But that's the law, and they made the law to establish and to keep those racist principles in practice. Wouldn't you want to change that? Wouldn't you want to fix that? I think that's necessary. And if the goal is one new man, if that's where God is taking us, if our future is united together, Jew and Gentile in Messiah, then the things that separate us, the things that we have put in place to keep us on different tracks, to keep us from recognizing each other and recognizing the relationship that we have, we should start trying to undo those things as much as possible as we are getting ourselves ready for the King's arrival. If we know that's our future, let's start making those changes and those decisions today. Let's start making things possible for Jew and Gentile to reconcile so much of our sordid history of hostility, primarily from the believing in Messiah side, targeting the Jewish side. Let's start fixing that problem. Shabbat is one of those things, because if we're violating one of the most important principles of biblical faith, of the faith of the Tanakh, of the Old Testament, if we're saying we don't want to have anything to do with that, then clearly we're not with them. So again, that's another fun one. Let me again encourage you to go and read that longer article if you want a fuller explanation of all of that on the blog section of the website. I may also encourage you to come to our services on Shabbat in Morristown, Tennessee. We meet at 1 o'clock, again, every Saturday, every Shabbat. May the Lord bless you in this continuing of the counting of the Omer.